Welcome. I'm Mike McGovern, professor of anthropology and director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies here. And it's my pleasure to welcome James Scott for his final talk in this one-week extravaganza in praise of floods. I'll just say a couple words about Jim in a vein that I think maybe we haven't heard so far, which is talking about him as a teacher. I had the pleasure of teaching with Jim. I wasn't his student, but we taught the famous Agrarian Societies course, which is kind of one of the main features of the Agrarian Studies program at Yale, and is always co-taught between Jim and some colleagues. And I have really vivid memories of those couple of years teaching together with Libby Wood and Shivy. And very happy ones. And I picked up a lot of stuff. I was just starting out as a beginning assistant professor, and I was just sort of watching and listening, not saying too much, trying to stay in my lane. But I picked up so much from Jim in those years. I remember one of the first times we met, he talked about training grad students and how a lot of people try to train grad students to continue the kind of work that they're doing, to reproduce themselves in their students. And I think Jim said something to the effect of, I can't think of anything more boring and futile than trying to do that, which is my own attitude until today. And you know, another thing I remember was the first meeting that you and Libby and I had about the syllabus we were going to put together. Libby and I came in, we hadn't discussed this beforehand, but we both thought, you know, we've got to teach one of Jim's books. And so we kind of insisted on Weapons of the Week. And he was absolutely adamant that we must not do any of his books. And by the end of a half-hour discussion, we convinced you. And I think it was the only time maybe that one of your books featured on that syllabus. And we had to agree to teach. I had just had my first book out, and I think we taught Libby's first book to counterbalance it. But of course, nobody really cared about my book, and they were all really interested to hear Jim talking about Weapons of the Week. One other thing I'll just say before I turn it over to him is there's this whole other side of Jim's pedagogical kind of profile, which is the conviviality that he embodied, and I'm sure still does in New Haven, especially through agrarian studies, but also with his students, constantly hosting people at his farm, having us over for potlucks, and allowing the kind of very horizontal, just sort of free-form exchange of ideas that I think is, as he said several times during this visit, anybody that reads only scholarship from their discipline is probably going to just reproduce the same old boring stuff that is already coming out in the journals. If you're not reading poetry and you're not watching films and you're not reading novels, you're not really expanding outward. And I think that extends to the way that you approach teaching, which is as something that goes way beyond the classroom and all those exchanges, which I hope will continue tonight over dinner. I'll give you Jim.
Thank you. I've never done anything like this week, and so the little narcissist in all of us, right, in me, is pleased in a way that I find quasi-embarrassing and want to, I don't know, deny, but the fact is I'm appreciative and it's been nice to see. It's particularly been nice to see my work reflected here and there in things that I never would have thought they would be relevant to, and so one always hopes writing a book is like throwing a bottle with a note in it and hoping that someone on some foreign shore will pick it up. This week has been, a conversation with a lot of people who picked up little fragments here and there, so I'm grateful. This is actually, I don't know, I want you to stop me after 40 minutes because I don't know how much of the second portion of this I will get to. But this is a book on rivers, and particularly a book on the Irrawaddy River. And the first part of it, I'll talk more about rivers, and the second part, I'll talk more about the Irrawaddy in particular, if I'm able to get to it. I've been teaching a seminar on river. I had been teaching a seminar on rivers until I retired 3 years ago. And I've done actually a lot of fishing and canoeing, so rivers are kind of part of my general sort of interest that I never imagined in a million years I'd be writing a book on rivers. But I've written a lot of books I never imagined I would write in the first place anyway. And when I started teaching about rivers, I was reminded of a germinal conversation I had that at the time was relatively humiliating, about 15 years before I began to teach about rivers. And I found myself at a conference in which there were two conferences taking place at the same time, one of hydrologists and one of Southeast Asianists. And I was, of course, a Southeast Asianist. But we were ordered to fraternize at lunch and dinner by sitting next to one another and having conversations, right, across our very, very, very disparate fields. And I found myself sitting next to an extraordinarily bright and interesting and well-read Philippine hydrologist working for the World Bank. And because we were ordered to be friendly and start a conversation, I thought, well, what am I going to say to a hydrologist? And I had recently learned, I suppose, in the couple of years before that the Colorado no longer got to the Sea of Cortez, right? It was dry for 3 or 4 months of the year. And there was a part of me that felt sad for the Colorado River, partly because, all our poetry of rivers going to the sea, that's their destiny. And in an effort to just start a conversation, I said, I had learned this about the Colorado River, and isn't it a sad thing? And he put down his knife and fork and turned his chair to me and said, no, it's the most important thing in the world. It means that every drop of water has gone to some important human purpose and not a drop goes to waste. And I thought, we are not going to have a long conversation. But it was kind of formative, and of course it caught that utilitarian view of water and rivers and so on in a kind of capsule, and he was adamant and almost moralistic about it. And but the fact, he is not alone. This was the general view historically in the period of river engineering. And I want actually to quote more lyrical Winston Churchill writing about the Nile River. And I quote, "One day, every last drop of water which drains into the whole valley of the Nile shall be equally and amicably divided among the river people, and the Nile itself shall perish gloriously and never reach the sea." So this is Winston Churchill on the use of the Nile River. Joseph Stalin shared the same view, but in a little less lyrical way. He said, water which is allowed to enter the sea is wasted. Now, anyone from the American Bureau of Reclamation or the Army Corps of Engineers would have said exactly the same thing, right? I want to begin with this sort of simple observation that everything moves, whether it's tectonic plates, and this goes, of course, for rivers. Rivers are, on a long view, living things. They're born, they die, they move, they're frequently maimed or even murdered. And even if there were no Homo sapiens around, rivers are always changing their course, changing their meanders, changing their channel, moving sediment, and so on in geological time. So rivers are in constant motion, in constant movement. And let me start out with this is Howard Fisk's wonderful, he was an Army Corps of Engineer person, but this is an effort to do 2,000 years of the Mississippi upper delta, and each of the colors are different channels that the Mississippi has followed over time. This was on the basis of 17,000 core samples that were able to pull up sediment and so on, and to identify the particular period at which the channel would have gone through that. And you can see it's a way, not only is it actually a beautiful thing to put on your wall as a piece of art, but it's an extraordinary effort to capture the movement of rivers and channels and meanders over time. He did a series of 18 maps from Indiana south to the upper delta. There's another section of that river. The river that probably has been moved most in some ways is the Yellow River, especially the lower delta of the Yellow River. And you can see here the period from BC, from 2278 BC, all the different shifts north and south of the Shandong Peninsula of the Yellow River over time. A more specific and more recent set of things since 1855 is captured there as well. And what's interesting, I think, is that in 1938, in order to stop the Japanese advance, Chiang Kai-shek destroyed the dikes, preventing the Yellow River from going south in order to slow the Japanese advance to the north. And it was quite successful, although 300,000 Chinese, an estimated 300,000 Chinese died as a result of being drowned, of losing their crops, and famine, and so on. So it's the, what's interesting is that movement north and south of the Shandong Peninsula is a natural movement exacerbated later by human intervention, but it's a natural movement as well. That is to say, what happens is in that the coastal plain of the Yellow River is extremely flat. The gradient to the sea is very, very small. And it means that as the water comes down from higher altitudes, it slows down, and the sediment is precipitated out of the river and raises the bed of the river. So the river, over time, creates its own dike or levee by depositing, as it slows down, depositing sediment, and then it goes to the sides, right? And then those sides, one of those sides becomes a main channel. It deposits sediment, and another sort of passage is made. So it is the low gradient and the creation of levee, the self-damming aspect of rivers that creates all of these new channels. Each flood raises the land flooded by the deposition of sediment, so that the floodplain, to return to the River Nile, is now 10 feet higher than it was 5,000 years ago, just by the accumulation of sediment. And that's, of course, why you have to dig for remains of many of the Nile Valley settlements for that point. So the kind of changes that I'm talking about can come either gradually or they can come precipitously. I spent an entire decade every summer when the academic year closed in central Pennsylvania along Penns Creek, which is one of the best trout streams in Pennsylvania, and living right beside Penns Creek. And I had this idea, you could see every year that the ice in the spring had exaggerated meanders, had carved out more of the bank where it ran faster. And so I got this idea that gradually that the Penns Creek was changing its bed ever so little, but every year in a fairly systematic way. And then to my surprise, there was the flood of, I think, 1973, in which 99% of the changes in the bed of Penns Creek was changed in 3 hours at high water at flood stage. And I realized that my idea of smaller geological changes year by year annually was overwhelmed by catastrophic events, unusual events, in which the Penns Creek jumped its bed, carved out a completely new channel, and so on. And so, of course, it was the 1972 flood, and it's those sudden jumps that when you have a meander that looks like a necklace, at flood stage, the water often cuts through the narrowest part of that necklace and creates what we call oxbows. Well, you see 1, 2 oxbows there, and at the lower end of this illustration, there's another oxbow waiting to be created in a flood that would break the barrier between the most narrow part of the lower river. Here's an actual picture of an oxbow that was once the main channel, and also a soon-to-be oxbow just above it. So the river is moving all the time, and one of the ways in which I learned this on the Irrawaddy River was that I spent a lot of time on the Irrawaddy River. It's a good way to see the country. And on a trip from Mandalay to Bagan, which is the ancient capital of Burma, founded in 9th century AD, it's about a day trip, and I was on a boat that only had 20 passengers, so it was not. It was a fairly shallow draft boat of an experienced captain who'd been doing this for 15 or 20 years. And what was interesting to me is that he did not trust himself on any trip to navigate the changes in the bed of the river. And so after he started, he would take on a pilot at a particular village. And this pilot was the specialist for about an hour and a half of exactly how the bed had changes, how the currents, how the sandbanks had changed. And he would take over and be the pilot. And when his knowledge ran out, another pilot got on the boat, he got off, and that pilot took us another hour and a half or so. And when his knowledge of the bed was exhausted, we took on 4 pilots. And each of these pilots, in a sense, had the day-by-day, week-by-week sense of exactly how the bed of the river had changed. This was, of course, in probably March, February, when the Irrawaddy is at its lowest period. But the point is that the shifts day by day and week by week were such that this experienced pilot did not trust himself to navigate the river except because of the change. So the river's moving all the time, and on larger boats, it's often common in this period for the boats to become stuck. This is a picture of the Irrawaddy in general. You can see where Bagan is, you can see where Mandalay is, and the upper middle part. That's the part I'm talking about. And the delta, which I will not be talking much about, but could. So those who have read Life on the Mississippi and Mark Twain will notice that this bamboo pole is exactly like the Mark Twain marking on the twine is, right, 2 fathoms. The way in which Mississippi riverboats had to throw out, right, a rope in order to measure the distance and the clearance between the riverbed and the bottom of the ship, and there are 2 on each side of the prow of the larger boats, and when they come to sections of the river that are shallow, they scream, 2.5 feet, 1/4.5 feet, and so on, back to the pilot so he knows when he's likely to be in danger. And it doesn't always work. And so what happened in this particular case, which I happen to have a photograph of, is that we got stuck. And the problem is we got stuck going south, that is, going downstream. And when you get stuck going downstream, it's harder, partly because it's harder to back off because the current is working against you. And that's why ships going downstream have priority over ships going upstream, because the danger of getting stuck when you're going downstream and extracting yourself are that much more difficult. So what they did, you can see how shallow the water is, right? These people are not even up to their waist. And they're put off the stern of the boat. You can't see it, but what they're doing is embedding a pole in the bed of the river, and that will be attached to a cable, which will be attached to a winch at the back of the boat. You can see more closely. And then the winch will wiggle the boat back and forth in order to get it off of the sandbank over time. And it almost always works, but it doesn't always work. And once in a while, the ship actually has to be abandoned, and you put on a skeleton crew so its pipes and engines are not stolen, and wait for the rains to come when the bed of the river rises. One thing more about rivers as living things. I'm sure you've heard on the TV or radio again and again things like, this is a 100-year flood, this is a 500-year flood, this is a 50. I urge you to pay no attention at all to these things. Rather, that is to say, for example, just to start with an anomalous observation, the Rhine had 4 100-year floods in 12 years. One in 1983, one in 1988, one in 1993, and one in 1994. That should give you some pause about the meaning of a 100-year flood if there are 4 of them in 12 years. Something must be a little wacky about this. Of course, statistically, this anomaly could happen every, 1,000 years or so. Why is the idea of a 500-year flood or a 100-year flood so stupid? It's stupid for 2 reasons. One of them is we simply do not have the statistical series on water level and volume flows that go back more than 100 or 200 years on almost any river. Even those like the Yangtze and the Yellow River or the Rhine or Danube or Euphrates, they're partial exceptions because we have longer data and we have good data on the Nile going back quite some time. But generally, almost all rivers that we know of do not have the statistical series that would permit us to make statistical generalizations. You have to have a whole series of 500 years, right, and see how many floods there are. That's not the main problem. The main problem is that it's not the same river from year to year. The idea that we're dealing with a constant river that can be measured from year to year in order to ascertain what is a 500-year flood. The fact is that after 25, 50 years, depending on the activity, depending on the rainfall, depending on the agriculture, on the deforestation, the flow and, if you like, the hydrology of the river has completely changed. So it's not, in a sense, the same unit that you're measuring, especially after 10, 20, 30, 40, or 50 years. It's moving silt and clay, it's carving new channels and meanders, its normal flood stage is building natural levees. And if we add anthropogenic changes, it's radically not the same river. I think I mentioned that in 1800, most of the Mississippi bank was forested, and by 1960, 95% was in agricultural crops. This meant that the runoff from rain events and so on was that much faster because of drainage, because field crops had replaced trees, wetlands had been drained and cleared, and so on. The most important, however, and this is the core of what I have to present today, is that the most important movement in the annual life of a river is the flood pulse. That is to say, that part of the year during which the river overflows its channel banks and occupies its habitual floodplain. The pulse of high water may come from the monsoon or from snow or glacial melt or from seasonal rainfall, and it may be of different degrees of variability. But the point is, it's a natural part of the annual cycle of a river, so that when, in a sense, we're all deceived, when we see a map, we see this line that says Mississippi River, Yazoo River, Delaware River, right, what have you, and it's a line on a map, as if it's always in the same place. The fact is that the Amazon is 80 miles wider in its flood stage than it is in the lower rainfall period of its life. So the point is that what is interesting about the flood pulse is that it creates the wetlands and what I would call the crucial for biodiversity, the in-between ecology. That is to say, that part of the river floodplain and littoral riverine floodplain that is sometimes dry and sometimes wet. And there are a tremendous number of forms of life that depend on this in-between, not the river and not dry land. And if you want to understand in a stupid and simple way what humans do to rivers, is that they try to turn rivers into either water or agricultural land, and what they hate is mud. Mary Douglas would understand why mud doesn't belong right in either of these categories and is disturbing. So you can, in a curious way, you can see that the state is an engine for the extirpation of mud. That is to say, wetlands, all this in-between world that I'm talking about. So the flooding of the floodplain represents, in an almost literal sense, the lungs of the river, the condition of its vitality and that of all the creatures who depend on it. Without the annual flooding of the floodplain, the channel, which we usually associate with the river at rest in paintings and in photographs, is comparatively dead, biotically speaking. Flood is a scare word. If I had my way, I would ban its use, but I'm not going to have my way. On this view, we would understand the flooding of settlements near the river by Homo sapiens encroaching on the natural floodplain as an act of trespass. The periodic flooding of the floodplain is the life, world, and condition of existence of all the species who inhabit the river or dwell along the river. I'm afraid this is not very legible, to use a term I use elsewhere. This is from a book called The Silver Lining, and it's about disturbance ecology. And each of these represents a different part of the flood pulse and the way in which it invades the land, right? You can see that dark line, horizontal line, is the river at rest at the top, how it rises, enters the riverine forest area, declines, and so on. Fish, for example, get as much as 80% of their total annual nutrition from the flood pulse and the flood stage, at which time they spread over the floodplain. They leave the channel of the river and spread over the floodplain. There they spawn and put on weight. They feed on the invertebrates, the decaying organic matter, the microbes that are on the floodplain. There's a huge migration of fish, a kind of frenzy, to take advantage of the nutrition that that's available. And the anadromous fish, salmon, the migratory fish, salmon, alewife, herring, shad, that are both seagoing and freshwater fish, rush for the food. And the floodplain may be 40 times wider than the actual channel of the river. I mean, so great that in the Amazon, there are fruit-eating fish, and they depend on the highest level of the water where they can reach the low-hanging fruit, because the variation is so huge, they are able to, in a sense, access nutrition, but only at the height of the flood pulse. The Mississippi fish catch had declined 83% over 50 years until 1993, when there was a massive flood. And the catch the year after was the biggest catch on record in the last 50 years. The studies of the Danube have shown that the greater the extent of the flood in a given year, the greater the fish haul in the following year. And it's not just fish, but a whole cavalcade of all those creatures that depend on such a concentration of nutrition. The waterfowl, the riverine wetland birds, the heron, the muskrats, the foxes, the wolves, the raptors, and so on. The fresh grass sprouting after flood that recedes, and the herbivores rushing for the new and fresh grass, which is extremely important, and all the microparasites that feed on this cavalcade. And to top it off, when the flood recedes, it brings back an enormous amount of that nutrition back into the channel, so that the mollusks and clams and mussels and channel catfish, those things that are not able to leave for the floodplain, the nutrition is brought to them by the recession of the flood, bringing nutrition back into the main channel. So without the flood pulse, even those forms of life that remain in the channel would starve to death, essentially. The point is that as a flood recedes, it provides, along with its tributaries, most of the nutrients that are available in the channel. What a flood does, in one sense, is to provide connectivity. It moves water over the landscape, creating a huge variety of habitats. It creates backwaters, ponds, marsh environments, slow-moving, warmer water, refugees from larger predators, varied assemblages of food and habitat that favor different riverine species. And in particularly both the European, Northern European and American context, the history of the beaver is absolutely central in this way. That is to say, the rivers that we're accustomed to observing are not the rivers that the Europeans first encountered when there were billions of beavers who actually blocked water and prevented it from rushing into the tributaries and downstream, and held it for quite some long time in order to create their own particular habitat. The whole mechanism depends on the microbial richness of the floodplain that represents the base of the pyramid for the entire life world of the river. Without the flood pulse, then, the river is comparatively dead. What I mean, of course, here, and it's the difference, I think, of my book and many other books, is that I want to concentrate on, most books are about H2O and human beings, and I'm interested in particular in the non-human side of riverine life world, partly because it's vastly neglected, and it seems to me to be so crucial. So I mean to emphasize non-human species here, but let me say a little bit about our species, what the flood pulse does for human beings. The most numerous and successful invasive the world has ever known. What the flood pulse does is to create civilization. That is, no floodplain, no civilization. Oh, that's almost true. Almost without exception, all archaic civilizations were found on the floodplains, often near the estuary of a river. Why? It's the only place where you can have a concentration of foodstuffs and people in a small circumference in which state making is possible. Look at what the flood does. The flood is like an agriculturalist in some senses. That is to say, first of all, it gets rid of all the competing vegetation by drowning it. Then it lays down a layer of nutritious silt, fertilizer, if you like, that provides nutrients to crops. And if it's a well-behaved flood, as in the Nile Valley generally, it leaves behind a perfectly harrowed field ready for sowing. You don't have to plow. All you can just broadcast seeds, right, and practice agriculture. And that's the reason why the first agriculture in the world, in most cases, is called flood recession agriculture, right? Or I think it's called écru in French. It's the oldest and easiest form of agriculture. It's the only form of agriculture that has a return comparable to hunting and gathering of previous forms of subsistence. Or it's called flood retreat agriculture. A couple of examples. This is the eastern wetlands of the US, and Native Americans would plant crops on small stream units that were left behind when the flood receded, because it left quite nutritious soil. In some places it left sand, which were not as productive, but it was easy to tell the difference, and they were important aspects of the sort of minimal agriculture of indigenous Americans before the Europeans. This is the upper Irrawaddy, and this is a huge island. This is if you like, flood retreat agriculture. These are alluvial islands created by floods, and it provides unbelievably nutritious soil for the planting of crops. People have to build often bamboo bridges in order to get to them, or to get to them by boat. But villages will actually, in the old days, would have warfare about who got to sort of plant these areas. They were, in a sense, if you like, areas prepared for agriculture in almost every respect by the flood pulse itself. And you can find these alluvial islands all the way down the Irrawaddy into the delta of the Irrawaddy itself. And they were, the division of these lands between villages was a very elaborate kind of thing in terms of who got to plant what section. And in some cases, the alluvial islands got enough nutrition and sediment and so on, so they became permanent islands, right? And then became what we think of as actual villages that are much, much less prone to devastating floods. But there are a lot of, if you like, seasonal alluvial islands that were important agriculturally. I'm sorry. This is the marshes as escaped. So the way in which people understand floods, the flood pulse, is in environmental texts. It's called disturbance ecology. And it's the best way of conceptualizing what natural occurring floods do is through the lens of disturbance ecology. I don't like the term disturbance very much, because it risks obscuring the fact that floods are often annual, natural, and fairly predictable. That is, they're not disturbances, or, put another way, the disturbances are natural disturbances. But it is proposed, disturbance ecology is meant to be in contrast to equilibrium analysis, in which a succession and distribution of fish and insects and birds reaches a terminal state that is stable, right? And so disturbance ecology is an effort to sort of undo a previous, right, understanding of progression to a terminal state. But as we can see, the prevention of the forceful stopping of these natural perturbations, that's the real disturbance. That's the real intervention, the attempt to enforce a permanent equilibrium. And the way of understanding what states and high modernist engineering do to rivers is in an effort to, in a sense, enforce a permanent equilibrium by preventing floods. You could say that a river sings many songs, and industrial engineering tries to make it sing usually a single song, either hydroelectric power, irrigation, navigational channels, reservoirs, what have you. The point is that, or flood prevention and so on, or water pipe. The point is that there's this effort to, if you like, shape a river and its natural movement which usually fails when catastrophic events eventually, but it's an effort to, in a sense, reduce the river to the production of a single important commodity process, an environment that is valuable to Homo sapiens. Whereas the patchiness that's created by floods creates a tremendous amount of diversity and amplifies it. That is, it caters to flood-adapted marine life, to flood-adapted insect life, to flood-adapted flora, to seeds that have been waiting a long time for floods, to quick colonizing species from adjacent patches, and slower colonization from further away. It's a favorable spawning environment for particular selections of fishes, insects, and birds who do best in uncrowded environments that have recently been flooded and sort of cleared. That makes a valuable, if you like, environment for their own propagation. This is what happens, in a sense, without humans. And humans can use and shape this process in the ways that I've described. How am I doing in terms of time?
You're around 40 minutes, but we've got 2 hours, so I think you can.
So I will not get to the, I'm going to just ignore a whole chapter. I try to make with rivers, in particular for the Irrawaddy, a distinction between, and was a surprise to me actually in my historical reading and environmental reading, that I thought that the intervention in rivers was essentially a product of industrialization, that earth-moving machinery, reinforced concrete, if you like, that high modernist river engineering, and of course that accelerated all of the massive changes in rivers and dikes and levees and so on. But what surprised me is that most of the changes in rivers have occurred before industrialization. And most of the changes in rivers are a result of agriculture and drainage and deforestation and the growth of population that changes the hydrology of the river and the movement of sediment over time, such that the river, let's say in the 9th century in Bagan, and the river before industrialization in, let's say, 1850 or 60, before anything like mechanized industrialization comes to Burma, most of the changes in the river have already occurred with levees and dikes and the prevention of the water intruding into the floodplain to protect agriculture, and it's not, and the deforestation. The deforestation is not just to clear the land for agriculture, but it is for, of course, firewood, construction, and it is for pre-industrial industry. That is to say, pottery making, metallurgy. So, for example, Bagan had something like 20,000 religious structures, temples, stupa, monasteries, and they were all built with kiln-fired bricks. And they were done in the dry zone, and the dry zone, right, is partly the dry zone and drier than it ever was because of the deforestation of the entire dry zone. It gets relative, it's in the shadow of the Arakan Yoma, and so it doesn't get much of rainfall in the first place. And the result is that, so that by the time you come to industrial transformation of the river, a tremendous number of changes have already taken place. And so it seems to me that I think I want to stop maybe with an observation that it's something I tried to elaborate a lot more than I have a chance to do so here today. But it's a question of flood control, I guess. So the history of flood control I'm thinking about how to do this economically. The effort to control floods is, by building levees and dikes, is to prevent the river from invading its floodplain. And therefore, it has this effect of forcing the river to deposit its sediment in the riverbed to which it is confined. And because it creates a single channel and blocks off the movement of this water into the peripheral wetlands and so on, it means the water goes much more quickly to the sea. The runoff, because of drainage and agriculture, is much greater and so on. And you have this sort of different river. The result is that and I do have an example of that, I think, somewhere here. It's in Kaifeng in China on the Yellow River. Do I have this? Yeah, here we go. In Kaifeng, the river is 30 to 40 feet. The river bed is 40 or 50 feet higher than the surrounding floodplain. So the river it's not a river, it's a fucking aqueduct, right? That is to say, and the reason it's an aqueduct is because over time, the building of levees and the confining of the water has meant the deposition of sediment so that the riverbed is constantly rising, and in order to compensate for that, you have to build bigger dikes and higher levees and so on in order to prevent the catastrophic floods. And of course, then you get a catastrophic flood. 1927 along the Mississippi, 1993 along the Mississippi. So the prevention of small floods and all of the, if you like, micro-engineering to prevent small floods, does prevent small floods. However, it sets you up for a truly catastrophic flood, right? The parallel is forestry and the prevention of forest fires. That is to say, 80 years of making sure that all fires are extinguished by the next morning, and Smokey the Bear and the Forest Service preventing any fires resulted in preventing a lot of forest fires, small forest fires. But it also created the accumulation of combustible material that made for catastrophic forest fires at some later date. So there's a kind of there's an analogy here, I think, between, if you like, forgive me for a quasi flight of fancy into medicine, but it's a little like the prevention, our effort to prevent small infections by the profligate use of antibiotics has created selection pressure for viral for infections that are that cannot be controlled, And so in a sense, the effort to prevent small infections sets you up for the hospital infections, for the infections that are almost impossible to control. And so there's a way in which I haven't quite worked this out, but the prevention of living with small disasters, which are in their way, like floods and fires, have hugely valuable ecological results and so on. The prevention of these small little disasters creates the conditions under which a much greater disaster of the same kind is likely to occur. It is, and so there's this word, I think I used it the other day, iatrogenic illnesses, that iatrogenic illnesses are illnesses created by prior treatment, and it's responsible for a lot of hospitalizations. And so anyway, there's something there about living with small problems and avoiding rectifications. I use the word rectification because the original, there's a treaty about the Rhine called the Rectification of the Rhine, as if God had screwed up and had not organized the Rhine the way it should be organized. And so if you like, the rectification of these small, if you like, disasters with benefits results in setting you up for huge disasters. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, we've got plenty of time for Q&A, and I think Derek is monitoring the Zoom. So yeah, 2 microphones. Christian.
Wow. Okay. Would you suggest that floods are analogous to riots?
Are they analogous to riots?
Yeah. Because what you just said about flood prevention, I put in the context of riot prevention. Leads to development of combustible material, which leads to a perhaps even larger explosion subsequently. And this is actually something I think we talked about like maybe 15 years ago when you were referring to, you referred to riots as, there's a book that came out just called In Defense of Riots, which makes a similar point, but they didn't cite you, by the way. But you had made this point about riots being perhaps the most genuine manifestation of popular sentiment regarding a particular issue because it wasn't channeled through any organization, it wasn't channeled through any attempt to kind of like suppress it. It was just, and thus that it was the most dangerous expression that you could possibly have. But yes, I have resistance on the brain, but listening to your discussion of floods, all I could think about was, wow, it seemed to be similar to your discussion of riots earlier. And am I?
It's interesting. I hadn't made that connection until you made it, and the first thing that comes to mind, I'm inclined to say yes, right? The short answer, and one of the things that pops into my mind is the structure of local politics in what I understand to be the case for Xi Jinping's China, in which demonstrations and marches and protests are permitted at the village level for people who've been corrupt, who've stolen land, local officials who are hated and so on. And it's just sort of, if you like, it's a level of democratic voice that is permitted in order to, figure out whether they can intervene and get rid of these officials and solve the problem. And what's not permitted is that they accumulate into a province-wide movement, in which case they're suppressed instantly. And so there's a way in which, I mean, you could say that a riot is already an example of failed local, I'm thinking of all the ways in which ancien regimes that are, or autocratic regimes have of keeping their ear to the ground and figuring out the things that might cause them trouble. And of course they have systems of petitions, that I just talked about with someone a few minutes ago, works on Mexico.
Your flood pulse graphic with the showing what the flood did, and then it recedes, and then all this life is provided from the emergence of this thing. I'm hearing all these discussions about how the community is coming into itself in many respects in the wake of a flood. I mean, the riot takes place, and then there's all these expressions, and people are able to kind of like voice these things that they hadn't before. In defense of riots, talks about this whole defense of looting. Sorry, talks about it's like, oh yeah, now these products have, the value has gone to complete free. You know, it's completely free. And so once the riot recedes, or once the looting recedes, then there's a sense of normality and expression. I'm running with the analogy, but thank you for that.
So I don't know much about it, but I mean, it's a question I'm thinking of. How far does a non-democratic or autocratic regime go back in order to sense the problems that may rise to the problem of disorder, riots, protests, violence, and so on? And I'm reminded, I don't know much about them, I just know that I was told by someone who works on classical Rome that there's a name for a whole series of officials of the emperor or even of the consuls whose job was to go to the markets every day dressed as ordinary people and listen to the rumors and listen to the complaints and listen to the chatter in order to, in a sense, read the tea leaves, right, and nip things in the bud. And so, so in a sense, I mean, I'm partly the discussions I've had with some people here have, you know, caused me to think that that autocratic regimes have to develop one way or another, petitions, you know, what have you. They're all the ways in which they try to somehow figure out what is going on in a population which they will generally not let demonstrate, vote, riot, and so on. And all of those techniques are kind of interesting to compare.
Can I use my prerogative to ask a follow-up question? So Christian is following kind of your small solutions leading to big disasters, which is a kind of a materialist, I mean, this image is so striking. It's kind of a materialist theory which can apply in lots of different areas. But you began with Mary Douglas, who insists that it's not all about materialism, and the symbolic level is important. And when you were talking about mud as a problem, because it represents the failure to keep soil and water apart, right? I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on where these two things meet. It's kind of the old Marxist problem on, in the final instance, is it material causes or symbolic or ideological ones? Obviously, we don't need to choose between.
My first instinct is to say that there's no money in mud. That is to say, you know, you create land and you create property and you have taxes and cadastral surveys and confiscation of crops and so on, and manpower that's available for conscription and so on. You create water and you can have water rates, irrigation rates. There's a way of making money out of water as well. And mud is, there's, I don't know, I can't, that is to say, swamps and marshes are, you know, hard places for the state to police. So there's a part of the crude Marxist in me that wants to bring this back to not the problem of just categorization, but the way in which mud is also unprofitable, I suppose.
And yet you convinced us that mud, especially in the Nile floodplain, is the equivalent of fertilizer.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, it's
Yeah.
actually, and the fact is that, of course, although you can't expect the earliest cultivators to have understood what they were doing when they protected their fields from floods, right? And so over time, so to take the Burmese example, the dry zone was unbelievably fertile, and it was fertile because in geological time, the Irrawaddy was actually a gulf that went all the way up to Mandalay and deposited over time, rich soil. So these people found themselves in an area that was marginal in terms of rainfall, but had unbelievably rich, nutritious soils. And I don't think they could have understood the way in which they were both by deforestation leaching, if you like, the nutritional, right, soils that were underneath the trees and so on, or they understood the degree to which the faster runoff, right, and drainage would also, and the levees and dikes, that their land was becoming poorer and poorer and poorer, right? And of course there are parts of places along the Mississippi that didn't realize that either, right? So there's a degree to which I'll stop there.
Okay.
So thanks for a really generative talk, and I'm sorry that I came a little late, but I wanted to just rest a moment on your use of rectification.
Of rectification.
Yeah, and think about Detroit, and think about, like, here we are, in Michigan, basically this entire town, much of this part of the state just wants to revert to being wetlands. We all have our sump pumps going in our basements today, probably. And in Detroit, there is this remarkable, unlikely political victory that's happened in the past decade, less than a decade, which has overcome developer interests that wanted to put in high-end marinas and luxury home developments and shopping malls into the southern part of what's called the Detroit River, actually a channel between Great Lakes. And instead, it's been made into an international wildlife refuge, which is a wetland refuge managed across Canada and the US, which meet in Detroit. Okay. Restoration of that area. What I want to ask you about is whether rectification and restoration have interesting relationships here, and whether the emergence of restoration technologies in places like Detroit or the Irrawaddy, maybe, I don't know, are making it less possible to imagine a world where the work of rivers, as they were, can ever happen again. An example is invasive Phragmites species in Detroit. These are reeds that are very, very problematic. There really are only a few technologies that handle them well, and they're huge kind of harvester-like combines. I think they're only produced in Louisiana. I think there is only one company in the US that makes these things, and they're so big and expensive that you see the state of Ohio and the state of Michigan and the city of Detroit and the International Refuge and some of the tribes that still own fragments of that land in spite of the fact that they've been subjugated since the French and British came for fur trade. These people are all going in on these big machines together to buy them to maintain a Phragmites-free Detroit River. And that means, in a way, that although it's looking more and more ecologically like it used to, like a healthy wetland, it is not and cannot do that in the ways it used to. There's all this human mediation. So I guess my question is, are rivers a bit like everything else we're seeing now, where green technologies and green economies and the new biocapitalist regimes that are coming in and are maybe more ecologically or sedimentarily virtuous, are they equally inequitable, or are they maybe a new kind of bricolage that is governance-wise kind of great? Because I don't know, I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Like, if we look at restoration of rivers now and some of the emerging technologies and practices, do you have political hope about them? Or do you feel nostalgic for when a river was a river? If that makes sense.
The answer to your last question is yes, of course. So, I mean, two things occur to me in terms of the, rectification is actually about engineering,
Right.
right? And
Right.
so the idea, I think I have a picture of this. So this is the Rhine. This is the rectification of the Rhine. The Rhine lost 180 kilometers in length by the elimination of all the meanders and so on. So this is what rectification means. And Baron Haussmann said it was too bad that the Seine made a curve around Paris. It would be nice if it ran straight through Paris, right? It would have been more convenient for his effort to redo Paris. So, but it seems to me that restoration, I think, is I don't want to sound too cynical, but there's efforts at restoring along the Rhine all kinds of wetlands that have been completely destroyed. And so here and there are little Disney-like theme parks of wetlands, right, that are restored, but it is pretty trivial in terms of the hydrology of the whole river. And the two things that, as I understand, America did to destroy many of its rivers, which generally are north-south, are the 1826 Swampland Act that gave land title to states of all wetlands and marshes with the presumption that they would turn it into agricultural land, right? And so it was an effort to destroy all the wetlands. And the other thing, of course, is the destruction of the beaver, which were responsible for the creation of those wetlands in the first place, right? To a large extent, and it's quite extraordinary that I didn't quite realize this until I read people like Ellen Wall and so on the beaver, but all our ideas of what a stream looks like in the Orvis fly fishing catalogs and so on, right? They have no relationship to what these rivers were like when we had, I'm blocking, but we're talking about millions and millions and millions of beavers, right? And talk about the extirpation of a river engineering species that actually created enormously productive wetlands, right? Is those two acts are, they're beaver restoration efforts as well. They're, restoration for wetlands and so on. But it seems to me that they're trivial. Not that they're not well intended, but it's like picking up the trash along a polluted stream.
Got it. Yeah. And maybe then it's not worth worrying about whether restoration will fall into the trap of conservation more broadly by becoming a virtuous practice that in its own ways excludes and simplifies and exclude. Yeah.
Thanks. Hi. So I was really struck in your talk by all of the benefits that you discussed about floods, because as a conflict scholar, I've only ever focused on the harmful effects. So we have, on the one side, all of the ecological benefits and the ways that it has helped create civilizations, and on the other side, you have ways that it's destroying homes, livelihoods, causing migration, and in some cases leading to conflict. So my question is, how, or is it possible to reconcile these two conflicting truths?
So much of what one thinks of as the horrors of floods, and there are extraordinary events of floods that, right, we've not been able to prevent, right? So I don't want to gainsay the destructive effects of floods. But that said, it seems to me that what has happened, of course, is that we have built on the floodplain. And that is to say, and we provided insurance, and developers have built on the floodplain. And so, in a sense, because it's often valuable land, it's nutritious land, it's good agricultural land, and so on. And so, in a sense, I mean, there are places south of St. Louis where they have actually abandoned land, partly because it can't be insured anymore, and it then is if you like, it's given over to the flood. It can be used when it's not flooded for athletic fields and open, right, activities of one kind or another. But it's the disasters you're talking about of destroying homes and livelihoods and so on, it's because people are living on the floodplain. You know, so in a sense, the history of living on the floodplain is both I want to blame it on the history of development and subsidies and insurance policies, and that is, there's a kind of lock-in. That is to say, let's say you've built a whole town or city on a floodplain. You have representatives. Their job is not to move you out of the floodplain. Their job is to protect you from the floods, right? And so they're in charge of levees and dikes and all kinds of flood control measures, and they want to protect you surplus, as it were, right? And so it seems to me that the many of the human disasters that I don't want to gainsay are a product of building on the floodplain. If we didn't build on the floodplain, we wouldn't have those problems. I mean, that is, people, all you need to be is in the Piedmont, right? You just need to be not so many meters above, right? So I'm sympathetic to the human disasters, but see it as a anthropogenic effect of not understanding rivers and floods. And the question, of course, is, and I'll turn this question back to you. That is to say, to what extent how should our concerns be divided between the health of all the life forms for whom the river is their life world, on the one hand, as opposed to Homo sapiens' needs on the other? We're concentrated on Homo sapiens because that's what we are, right? And so I want to, give the Irrawaddy dolphins as much respect as I give the people who live along the Irrawaddy River, right? So I want to, by concentrating just on the effects of the Homo sapiens, you're ignoring, I think, our care, understanding, and responsibility for the other forms of life for whom the flood is crucial.
Can I push back?
Sure.
So what about the billions of people in Africa who only have a certain amount of hectares of land that they can,
Only a certain amount of what?
hectares of land in Africa that they can cultivate, that they can live on? Certain land isn't fertile. If it's where they can live versus where they're not able to live, then is it possible to say that that's the only place that they can survive? And if that's the only place they can survive, then
So, I mean, what you point to actually is a population problem. You know, we were in 1750, 750 million people. We're now 8 billion people. And the amount of land available for them is limited, as you sort of infer. And maybe they have no choice but to live in flood-prone areas. And that's, in a sense, an effect of the most invasive species in the world, right? Having kind of crowded themselves into these dangerous areas because there's nothing available. And historically, it seems to me that hunters and gatherers and riverine populations understood the capacity to move at the time of the flood, get out of its way, take its advantages and come back just as soon as the flood receded, and take advantage of the fishing and so on and the new grass that was available there. So it's not as if these people didn't understand floods. They in fact took advantage of the floods and understood that there were parts of the year in which they had to get out of the way. In fact, I don't know, in the tsunami, the famous tsunami in Sumatra and Aceh, what was interesting is the orang laut, the so-called sea people or sea gypsies, who live on boats and move between islands and so on. The people who lived on land were devastated by the tsunami. The orang laut understood, they're not literate, they understood from oral history that if the tide goes out massively, you better run to the little hills because it's going to come back as a tsunami. Many of these people for 3 generations had not experienced a tsunami, but in their oral history they knew that if the tide went way out, this was a possible sign of a tsunami, and they only had to go like 20 meters high, right? And they could get out of the way of the tsunami by and large. But they understood this from there, and so in a sense, people lived historically when they weren't jammed into no other choices available to them, to in a sense, understand the rhythms of the river and to take advantage of them. So push back again.
Thank you for the talk. I think my question is a bit more, I want to touch a bit more on the upstream, downstream politics, which I think
Ups and downs?
yeah, upstream and downstream politics, because like
Oh,
what
right.
I've been struck throughout this lecture and a lot of focus on the floods and the alluvial plain is that there's, in the discussions of river, there's almost an innate sense of inequality, like between like the upland communities and downland communities. So if we talk about Southeast Asia, for example, the Irrawaddy River or Chowpara or Mekong, like the upstream communities and downstream communities are almost differentiated politically or ethnically, right? So it's basically the valley versus the hills people, right? So, and a lot of the benefits of the river or the floods or like benefits from agriculture are concentrated among the downstream communities, right? And even in the advent of like electric dams, for example, one of the most contentious topics in Irrawaddy River recently is the construction of the Myitsone Dam, which is in Kachin State, to control floods and also generate electricity, but most of the benefits will actually go to the military government and also to people further downstream where they're more populated. So I'm just thinking like when we talk about flood. So when we talk about the politics of river, how does we talk about in a way or think about in a way that benefits people in the upland communities, whether we're talking about Burma or Thailand or Vietnam, where that's where a lot of Pale people live, and
Right.
not thinking about it, I believe, creates a sense of inequalities in between ethnic groups and also between the people that reside there. Thank you.
It's a great point. One of the, I think the problems of the study of a river, of most rivers, is that it concentrates on the stem of the river. Let's just say the main Irrawaddy as it begins below the Myitsone and the Malika and Mekah. And so in fact, the most important part of a river are its many tributaries. They're the ones that contribute much of the sediment, much of the water, and so on. So I think and I didn't make that clear in my talk, for which I apologize, but it seems to me we need to talk about watersheds and even the dew and the sort of small little rivulets. We need to talk about all of the catchment area, I guess it would be called by ecologists, that is the river. And it's interesting, of course, that all the pollution that you create upstream is the problem of the people downstream, by and large. And if you're interested in, let's say, deforestation, most of the deforestation has come from the Chinwin River, right? And you're correct that the higher you go in altitude, there's a difference in subsistence practices, ethnicity, language, and so on. So what's really interesting, and I haven't said that, it's a discussion we could have for endless evenings, that the Irrawaddy is the highway of Burmese civilization. That is to say, up to Myitkyina, by and large, you can find Buddhist populations praying to the same nats and the same Buddha, speaking a version of the same language, all the way down to the deep delta. And so this is, if you like, this is the highway, this is the connection. So the water joins rather than dividing people. And if you go 30 miles off the river into the Shan Hills, right, or the Arakan Yuma and so on, it's a different language, different practices, and so on. So the river is the mother of Burmese civilization, as many people would say anyway, right? And so it's a kind of, people are in touch, right, through commerce and exchange and so on across. It's a little like Brodell's Mediterranean world, applied to, in which a Mediterranean seaport is more connected to something 300 miles away across easy water than it is connected to something 30 miles up in the hills, right? So, and it's also, the other thing is worth emphasizing, we think of a river as a movement of water, which it obviously is, but it's also a conveyor belt for sediment, right? That is to say, sediment is always coming down, right? That river, and that's where the kind of human settlements, to go back to the question of human flooding, that much of the flooding is also anthropogenic in the sense that the need for firewood and timber and agriculture and so on means that you have to cut the forest, right? Or for metallurgy and pottery and so on. And how do you cut the forest? If you finish all the trees that are around the village, what do you do next? If you're on a river, you go upstream because you can float all the timber down, right? And so every big settlement tends to deforest the upstream as a kind of transport mechanism. And when they get too far away from the river, they have to do charcoal. The only point of charcoal is to concentrate firewood and make it more transportable, even though it's more costly in terms of the actual wood that's required. So.
Quick one, Jim, and then pass to Caroline. But one was, do you know,
Where are we?
over here,
Okay.
dude.
You again.
Me again. One was trying to, I guess, decenter the conversation on humans. So I think that's going to be an interesting task for you with this book and how to do it. But if you get kind of stuck on that, I was thinking of Sheikh Anta Diop's work from civilization to barbarism. He talks about Nile Valley civilization and the common response to flooding of the Nile and its creation of the Nile Valley civilization. So that would be a good example, I think, there.
Yeah.
But also, I thought of Annals of a Former World. You remember that book? Which talked about kind of this natural trajectory in the U.S. That he used to kind of like tell the story of the Earth. So it just seemed, but he was able to get away from the human-centric component and tell this different story. So as we seem to be struggling with stepping away from a human-centric kind of conversation, I thought of those two pieces. But
I think I need an email with these references.
Okay. Hi, Jim. I know yesterday I don't know a lot about rivers, sadly. I grew up around the Connoquenessing Creek in my town, but I know very little about them other than they do flood, and my dad would tell us to stay away from them. But I know a lot about horses, and I know a lot about horses. Horses, about raising horses and sort of keeping them alive, and I grew up around them because my family used to rescue them. So something I was thinking about as we were talking about these floodplains and how the river naturally overwhelms the vegetation and any sort of animal life or crustacean living there, but it also feeds them, and anything that comes back after the flooding often feeds the vegetation and the animals and crustacean living in the water, not in the floodplains, and especially animals like you were saying, clams or oysters that can't move into the floodplains. Something that I started thinking about as you and Kate were talking about humans and civilizations that live so close to the floodplains to the point of potentially their own destruction and disaster is why can't we distinguish self-preservation from overconsumption and exploitation? And the reason I use the example of horses is we had exactly two horse pastures, but at any given year we had anywhere from 5 to 10 horses living in a barn, and they would graze only on those 2 horse pastures. But something I noticed as a kid is they would always leave certain patches sort of extra. So they would eat a section of the pasture until it was bare, so it was pretty much dirt. And there was nothing they could get out of it. But they would leave like corners of the pasture still fresh and green and beautiful, and the bugs would grow. And so throughout the spring and summer, as the weather changed, they would switch from corner to corner to corner. They never grazed the entire field to the point of its destruction because they knew somehow intuitively that they needed to continue eating that same pasture land for months at the time before the winter came. And so why can't humans seem to catch on to that? That we, like horses, are trying to use these floodlands, these wetlands for our survival, for our nutritional value, for our existence and self-preservation. But we seem to take it a little too far and overconsume to the point of its degradation and our eventual destruction.
So it's interesting how you put it. There are a million directions I can go. Let me talk for a moment about sheep, which I raised for 20 years, which are a contrasting. That is to say, well, first of all, let me start in a humorous way. That I realize as a mediocre farmer that a lot of the things we use in language are agrarian metaphors that for example, the first time I was weeding a long um, a long garden of weeds, essentially for peas. And I got to the end of it, and I leaned on the hoe, and I said to myself, what a long row to hoe. And I thought, oh my God, that's where this expression belongs, right? This was a long row to hoe. Well, so for sheep, for example, the idea the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, well, when they have eaten all the pasture inside the fence, you'll find them on their knees with their head for the fence because the grass is greener on the other side of the fence. But the point is that, and far be it for me to slander sheep, but the fact is that if you put sheep in a big pasture, that they will eat the tastiest things in that pasture. And that if you continue to do that over time, you'll have spiky fern, you will get all the things that they don't want to eat, and they will take over the field. So it's not as if they're, they have the sense of horses, I guess, which is your view of horses, anyway. And so the way in which you pasture sheep is to confine them in a place and force them to eat everything down to the ground, and then move the fences over 10 yards and give them another patch and let them finish that. But that is to say, they have to eat the bad stuff too before they get to move to a new place, right? And so there's a way in which a herd of sheep, and this is of course, this is anthropogenic too in its way. This is a large herds of sheep are likely to be able to move much greater distances. And if you think, Christian and I were talking about this great book called Barbed Wire, or someone, right, which also has to do with the history of the confinement of animals and the way in which before barbed wire, you would have the herbivores, native herbivores of North America moving north and south over time, right, depending on floods and conditions and changes in seasons in order to take advantage of the freshest grass, right, everywhere. And it's the kind of barbed wire that forced them into an ecology that was more confined than the ecology that they were accustomed to exploiting. So.
So I have a question pitched at a comparative question pitched at a pretty wide scale, temporally, spatially. So I'm thinking about, these pre-industrial, classical, agricultural kingdoms, right, and civilizations organized around rivers, right, Yellow River, Mekong, Jalpre, Irrawaddy, on and on. And you could, seems to me, the way you were talking about it, you could imagine them, they're founded on regimes for both controlling and caging rivers, but then also living synergistically with floods on the rivers. And what I'm wondering is, are these regimes across these zones, are they all just basically themed, variations on a single theme? Or are there really different modalities for thinking about how these regimes work technologically, ecologically, socially, even symbolically, ideologically?
So I guess one place to begin is the famous book by Wittfogel, in which the claim is made that classical civilizations survived by controlling the water and controlling the river, right, and so on. And it turns out that Wittfogel's wrong. I mean, just wrong in almost every respect. So that along the Nile, the pharaohs along the Nile, the state had nothing to do with irrigation. All you had to do, because there's a natural levee of a river, as it sort of floods, it drops the heavier stuff first, and so it creates this sort of, mound that may become quite massive over time. And so it creates its own levee. And all the villages had to do along the Nile is poke a hole in this natural levee and at high water and let the water in and then plug up the levee, and it would water all the lands, the lower lands behind, and that's where they would plant. And so the state had no, and all of the, what's interesting about all the irrigation in upland Southeast Asia, it's all organized by village cooperation and not by the state. And so the idea of I forget what Wittfogel calls it, hydraulic civilization or something like that. It turns out that the state, it's only later when you have the degradation of soils and the levees in which the state takes over some forms of irrigation, right? Where it becomes something like an hydraulic state and able to control people by the use of water. But that's much later, historically. And, there's I suppose, what's interesting about the Irrawaddy and in Southeast Asia generally is that the earliest agricultural settlements are not along the main stem of the river. It's too dangerous. It's along the sort of smaller tributaries in which you have smaller floods, easier to control over time, and at a relatively higher altitude, right? And those are all, if you like, fairly small interventions. That is to say, I'm not against engineering rivers, especially the small weirs that there's a, if you read Mark Elvin's book on a retreat of the elephants, it's a 4,000-year environmental history of China, and it contrasts, there's a chapter on what the Chinese called river masters. And there were two schools of river mastery. One of them was the Confucian school, which was essentially make that goddamn river do what we want it to do. And then there was the Taoist school of river mastery saying, we have to work with the movement of the river to our advantage, so we create weirs that open when the water pressure becomes of a certain kind and a certain height. That is to say, we have to respect the things that we can't control about the river and take advantage of them and so on. And I gather historically, it's not true anymore, but the Japanese had this Taoist view in which they would put a little weir in a river with a particular purpose in mind, and then they'd watch it for 2 years and figure out where the water went, whether it did what they expected it to do or didn't, right? And they would then enlarge the weir, remove it, change it. But the idea was, and that's the crucial thing, that is to say, and it's a crucial thing about, I think, our interventions in the environment is that, to paraphrase Bill Clinton, it's the economy, stupid. It's ignorance, stupid. That is to say, the Taoist idea was premised on the fact that we don't understand exactly how the river is going to move. We have to observe it over time. And so in that sense, it seems to me, we know so little about our interventions in the natural world and their knock-on effects and cascades and so on, that in a sense, it's the cautionary principle becomes absolutely central, because we are the zookeepers for the natural world, and we're incompetent zookeepers, and we don't understand, nobody does, how that system works. We're trying to. And in a sense, and this goes back to seeing like a state, I suppose, the smaller the interventions that you make, the more likely they're reversible, correctable, and so on. And so the thing that terrifies me about global warming are the geoengineering people who want to put 1 billion satellites reflecting the sun, who want to seed the Pacific Ocean with iron filings. I mean, these kind of massive efforts to change the world's temperature and ocean temperatures and so on. They scare the shit out of me, I might say.
Thanks for the talk. You started answering my question in your last 2 or 3 sentences, so but I'll go ahead and ask it. As you were talking, I was transported back to my childhood in Houston, Texas.
Sorry, man, I'm having trouble following you.
Houston. I grew up in Houston. It's a big, giant floodplain.
Houston.
And one thing they're worried about there is increasing frequency and intensity of climate-related weather events. And I was just curious about your thoughts on how that affects the story you're telling and all of it.
I got nothing very intelligent to say about that, except that it adds a new massive, massive layer of uncertainty and unpredictability, right? And so, you know, it's ignorant, stupid. It makes me want to write the word ignorance in capitals that are bigger and bigger and bigger as we encounter untoward events. And of course, these events have to do with our prior interventions. This is iatrogenic, right? Illness of the planet, right? And, you know, it's my generation that, I mean, you don't have to go back very far in terms of carbon and so on. So, you know, if we could go back to the early 1930s, you know, a lot of the stuff was not in gear, as it were.
Do you have any? Okay, if we don't have any more questions, please join me in thanking Jim again.
Thank you.